A loyal husband discovers his wife's betrayal with his best friend. But when he confronts them, a shocking truth emerges that changes everything he thought he knew about trust and forgiveness. Ethan leaned back in his chair, a cold beer in hand, as laughter and chatter filled Jake's backyard. The familiar scent of sizzling barbecue and the warm glow of string lights created the perfect backdrop for another gathering of their tight-knit group. Claire stood by the grill, her laughter blending effortlessly with Jake's as they exchanged jokes. Ethan smiled at the scene, feeling grateful for the bonds they'd built over the years. But as the evening progressed, something tugged at Ethan's attention. It wasn't Claire's laugh, it was Jake's lingering gaze. Ethan brushed off the thought. Jake was his best friend, practically family, and Claire, she was his wife. Together, they were part of a circle that had weathered years of ups and downs. Suspicion didn't belong here. Later that night, after the guests had left, Ethan began cleaning up the living room. Claire was in the shower, and her phone buzzed on the table. It wasn't unusual for her to receive messages, but this time, something felt different. A familiar name, Jake, flashed on the screen. Ethan's stomach churned as he stared at the phone. He hesitated before picking it up, telling himself it was nothing. But when he unlocked the screen, his world shifted. The messages were casual at first. Plans for group outings, shared jokes. But as he scrolled further, the tone changed. Flirty remarks, late-night confessions, and finally, messages that confirmed what Ethan didn't want to believe. The betrayal was real. Claire stepped into the room, towel draped around her shoulders, her hair damp and cascading. Ethan quickly set the phone down, his heart pounding. "Everything okay?" she asked, her voice light and unsuspecting. He forced a smile, muttering something about tidying up before bed. Inside, a storm was brewing, but Ethan chose silence over confrontation, for now. That night, lying beside Claire, Ethan stared at the ceiling, his mind replaying every interaction between her and Jake. Flashes of their laughter, shared glances, and inside jokes now felt like puzzle pieces falling into place. How long had this been going on? Who else knew? The questions swirled in his mind, heavy and relentless. The next morning, Ethan stood at the window, watching the sunrise. The golden light painted a stark contrast to the darkness he felt inside. He knew he couldn't ignore what he'd seen, but he also couldn't risk an impulsive reaction. Confronting Claire and Jake required careful thought. One wrong move could shatter everything. As the days passed, Ethan's demeanor shifted. He became more observant, watching Claire and Jake during group outings. The subtle touches, the fleeting glances, things he'd once dismissed as harmless now felt loaded with meaning. At a casual dinner with friends, Emily, one of their closest confidants, leaned over to Ethan. "You okay? You've been quiet," she asked softly. Ethan offered a weak smile. "Just tired, that's all." But Emily's gaze lingered, as if sensing the turmoil he was hiding. Ethan wanted to tell her to unload the weight of his discovery, but something held him back. He needed time to understand the full extent of what he was dealing with. By the week's end, Ethan found himself alone in the living room, replaying the messages in his mind. He thought of Jake, the friend who'd been with him through every milestone, and Claire, the woman he'd vowed to love and cherish. The betrayal was a gaping wound, and Ethan couldn't see a way to heal it without unraveling their entire circle. As the clock struck midnight, Ethan made a silent vow. He would uncover the truth, not just the details of the affair, but the motivations behind it. And when the time came, he would confront them both. But for now, he would wait, observe, and prepare for the storm ahead. The days that followed felt like walking through a fog for Ethan. Every interaction with Claire and Jake was a delicate balance between maintaining appearances and fighting the urge to explode. At home, Claire was her usual self, cooking dinner, watching TV, and scrolling through her phone like nothing had changed. But to Ethan, everything had changed. He couldn't unsee the messages, the betrayal. At the next group outing, the tension in Ethan's chest was nearly unbearable. They had gathered at a cozy cafe downtown, a favorite spot for the group. Laughter and chatter filled the air, but Ethan sat quietly, swirling his coffee. Across the table, Claire leaned in close to Jake, showing him something on her phone. They both laughed, and Ethan felt a sharp pang in his chest. Was this what everyone else saw as harmless friendship? Or had others noticed too? Emily, sitting beside him, nudged his elbow gently. "You've been really quiet lately," she said, her voice low enough to avoid drawing attention. Ethan forced a smile, his jaw tight. "Just a lot on my mind," he replied. But Emily's eyes searched his face, her expression a mix of concern and curiosity. Ethan looked away, afraid that one more question might make him unravel. That evening back at home, Claire asked, "You've been so distant lately. Is something wrong?" Her tone was soft, almost vulnerable, but Ethan couldn't tell if it was genuine or an act. "Work's been stressful," he lied, avoiding her gaze. Claire placed a hand on his arm, her touch familiar yet now foreign to him. "You know I'm here if you need to talk," she said. Ethan nodded but didn't respond. Talking to her felt impossible. Each passing day chipped away at Ethan's emotional strength. Nights were the worst, lying in bed beside Claire while his mind replayed every message, every moment he'd witnessed between her and Jake. He began waking up earlier than usual, sitting by the window as the first rays of sunlight painted the sky. The quiet mornings gave him a brief reprieve from the chaos inside his head. At work, Ethan struggled to focus. His co-workers noticed his distracted demeanor, but he brushed off their concerns. He spent his lunch breaks alone, scrolling through photos of past group trips on his phone. In each picture, Jake was there, always by his side, always smiling. And then there was Claire, standing close to both of them. The images felt like a cruel reminder of how blind he had been. Ethan's pain began to manifest physically. He felt a constant tightness in his chest and had trouble sleeping. He tried running in the evenings, hoping the physical exertion would quiet his mind, but the weight of betrayal was unshakable. The only thing that kept him going was the determination to understand how deep this betrayal ran and why it had happened. One evening, as Ethan stood by the sink washing dishes, Emily called. "Hey, just wanted to check on you," she said. Her tone was casual, but Ethan could sense genuine concern. For a moment, he considered confiding in her. She was one of his closest friends, and her intuition was sharp. If anyone could help him, it was Emily. But the words caught in his throat. "Thanks, Em. I'm okay," he said instead. A beat of silence passed before she replied. "You know I'm here, right? If you ever need to talk." Ethan nodded, even though she couldn't see him. "I know," he said softly before hanging up. As the days stretched into weeks, Ethan's silence became a shield, protecting him from the chaos that would inevitably follow once the truth came out. But with each passing moment, he felt the cracks forming in that shield. Sooner or later, he knew it would shatter. Ethan sat in his car outside Emily's house, the engine idling as he debated whether to go inside. The evening sky was a deep blue, stars faintly visible above the suburban neighborhood. After weeks of holding everything inside, the weight had become too much to bear. If anyone could give him clarity, it was Emily. She had always been the one in the group who saw beyond the surface, the one who could untangle even the messiest situations. Ethan took a deep breath, killed the engine, and walked to the door. Emily greeted him with a warm smile, but it quickly faded when she saw the tension in his face. "Ethan, what's wrong?" she asked, stepping aside to let him in. He hesitated, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. "I need to talk to you," he said, his voice low. Emily led him to the living room, where they sat on opposite ends of the couch. "Is it about Claire?" she asked softly. Ethan's heart sank. He hadn't even started, and Emily already had a guess. "You know something, don't you?" he asked, his eyes searching hers. Emily looked away, fiddling with a loose thread on a pillow. "I suspected, but I wasn't sure," she admitted. "There's been something off about Claire and Jake lately." The way they act around each other, it's different. Ethan let out a bitter laugh. Different. That's one way to put it, he said. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, and rubbed his face with his hands. I found messages on Claire's phone. They've been having an affair. Emily's hand flew to her mouth. Oh my God, she whispered. Then I didn't know it was that serious. I thought it was just flirting. Her words felt like another stab to Ethan's heart. You thought it was flirting and you didn't say anything, he asked, his tone sharp. Emily looked at him. Guilt etched across her face. I didn't want to jump to conclusions. I thought maybe I was overthinking it. Ethan shook his head, leaning back against the couch. Well, now there's no doubt, he muttered. The room fell silent, the only sound the faint ticking of a clock on the wall. Finally, Emily spoke. What are you going to do? I don't know, Ethan admitted. Part of me wants to scream at both of them, but what's that going to solve? I need answers, but I don't even know where to start. Emily placed a hand on his arm. Start with Claire, she said. You deserve to hear her side of the story, no matter how painful it is. The next evening, Ethan sat across from Claire at their dining table. The air between them was heavy, filled with unspoken tension. Claire looked at him, her brow furrowed. What's going on, Ethan? You've been so distant lately. He stared at her for a moment, gathering his thoughts. I know, he said finally. Claire's eyes widened slightly, but she didn't speak. I know about you and Jake, Ethan continued, his voice steady. I saw the messages. Claire's face drained of color, and she clasped her hands together tightly on the table. Ethan, she began, but he held up a hand to stop her. Don't lie to me, he said, his tone sharp. I want the truth. All of it. Claire looked down, her shoulders slumping. It started a few months ago, she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. I didn't plan for it to happen. I felt like we were drifting apart and Jake was there. He listened to me, made me feel seen. Ethan clenched his jaw, his hands gripping the edge of the table. And you thought the solution was to betray me with my best friend, he snapped. Claire flinched at his words. I'm not trying to justify it, she said. I know I messed up, Ethan. I hate myself for it. Ethan leaned back in his chair, the anger and hurt swirling inside him like a storm. Do you love him? He asked, his voice barely audible. Claire's eyes filled with tears. No, she said firmly. It was a mistake. I don't want to lose you. The words hung in the air, but they brought Ethan no comfort. He stood, his chair scraping against the floor. I need time to think, he said, walking toward the door. Claire called after him, but he didn't look back. Later that night, Ethan sat in his car outside Jake's apartment. His hands gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles white. Tomorrow, he would confront the man he had once called his brother. But for now, he sat alone in the dark, trying to gather the strength to face the truth again. The next evening, Ethan parked his car outside Jake's apartment, his heart pounding like a drum. The warm glow of the building's lights felt mocking, a stark contrast to the cold storm brewing inside him. For years, this had been the place where he sought solace, a second home where he and Jake had shared countless laughs and memories. Tonight, it felt foreign, a battlefield. Ethan climbed the stairs slowly, each step feeling heavier than the last. At Jake's door, he hesitated. His fist hovered in the air, and for a moment, he considered walking away. But the image of Claire and Jake laughing together flashed in his mind, reigniting the fire in his chest. He knocked firmly, his jaw clenched. Jake opened the door, his easy smile faltering the moment he saw Ethan's expression. Hey man, Jake said cautiously. What's up? Ethan didn't wait for an invitation. He pushed past Jake and entered the apartment, his movements sharp and purposeful. We need to talk, Ethan said, his voice low but firm. Jake closed the door slowly, his posture tense. All right, Jake replied, trying to sound casual. What's going on? Ethan turned to face him, his eyes blazing. I know about you and Claire, he said, cutting through the pretense like a knife. The room fell silent, the weight of his words hanging in the air. Jake's face drained of color, and he opened his mouth to respond, but no sound came out. "Don't bother denying it," Ethan continued. "I saw the messages. I know everything." Jake swallowed hard, his gaze dropping to the floor. "Then I didn't mean for it to happen," he stammered. "It was a mistake, a huge mistake. A mistake." Ethan barked, his voice rising. "You betrayed me, Jake. You, my best friend, slept with my wife. That's not a mistake. That's a choice." Jake raised his hands defensively. I know I messed up. I wasn't thinking straight. It was a moment of weakness." Ethan stepped closer, his fists clenched. "A moment of weakness. How many moments, Jake? How many times did you have to remind yourself that this was wrong and do it anyway?" Jake flinched at the intensity in Ethan's voice. "I don't have an excuse," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "I was selfish. I let my feelings cloud my judgment." "Feelings?" Ethan spat. "So what, you love her now? Is that it?" "No," Jake said quickly, shaking his head. "It wasn't love. It wasn't anything real. I messed up, Ethan. I betrayed you, and I hate myself for it." Ethan laughed bitterly, the sound hollow. "You hate yourself? That's supposed to make me feel better? You think that erases the fact that you destroyed everything I thought I could trust?" Jake's shoulders slumped, and he looked at Ethan with pleading eyes. "I don't expect you to forgive me. I want you to know how sorry I am." Ethan felt the urge to punch Jake, to release all the anger and pain building inside him. But instead he turned away, running a hand through his hair. "Sorry doesn't fix this, Jake. Sorry doesn't erase what you did." Jake took a tentative step forward. "I'll do anything to make this right. Just tell me what I can do." Ethan spun around, his face a mask of fury. "You can disappear," he said coldly. "You can leave me and Claire alone and never come near us again." Jake nodded slowly, his eyes filled with regret. "If that's what you want, I'll do it." Ethan moved toward the door, his steps deliberate. Before leaving, he turned back one last time. "You weren't just my best friend, Jake. You were like a brother to me. And now you're nothing." The door slammed behind him, the sound echoing in the hallway. Ethan stood there for a moment, his chest heaving. The confrontation was over, but the pain remained, raw and unyielding. Back in his car, Ethan gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles white. He had thought confronting Jake would bring him closure, but instead, it left him feeling even more fractured. The road ahead seemed darker than ever, but he knew he had to keep moving forward. If not for himself, then to ensure that the people who had betrayed him would no longer have power over his life. Ethan sat quietly in the corner of the cafe, nursing a lukewarm cup of coffee. The once lively group of friends was gathered around their usual table, but the energy was different. Conversations were strained, and the laughter that once came so easily felt forced. Ethan's presence was like a storm cloud hanging over the group, and everyone felt it. Emily sat next to him, glancing nervously between Ethan and the others. Across the table, Claire sat with her hands folded tightly in her lap, her gaze fixed on the untouched cup of tea in front of her. Jake was absent. Ethan had made sure of that. Mark, the self-appointed peacekeeper of the group, finally broke the awkward silence. "All right, what's going on?" he asked, his tone light but probing. "The vibe's been off for weeks." Ethan took a deep breath, his fingers tapping the edge of his cup. He had debated whether to confront the situation publicly, but the lies and secrets had festered long enough. "You want to know what's going on?" Ethan said, his voice cutting through the tension. "I'll tell you." Claire's head snapped up, her face pale. Emily shifted uncomfortably in her seat, while Sarah, sitting next to Mark, looked genuinely confused. "Ethan, maybe this isn't the—" Claire began, but Ethan interrupted her. "Don't," he said sharply, his eyes locking onto hers. "Don't tell me this isn't the time. It's never the time, is it?" Mark raised a hand. Whoa, let's just... No, Mark, Ethan said, his voice firm. I'm done pretending everything's fine. I'm done sitting here with people who knew what was happening and said nothing. Emily froze, her face turning red. Ethan, I didn't know for sure, she started, but he cut her off. You suspected, and you didn't say a word, Ethan shot back. You let me sit here week after week, thinking everything was fine while my wife and my best friend... He stopped, his voice catching. The words were harder to say than he'd expected. Sarah's eyes widened in shock. Wait, what are you saying? She asked, looking between Ethan and Claire. Claire, is that true? Claire's eyes filled with tears, but she didn't speak. Her silence was answer enough. The table erupted into murmurs and sharp questions, everyone talking over each other. Mark leaned forward, his brow furrowed. Claire, is this true? He demanded. Yes, Claire said finally, her voice trembling. It's true. The table fell silent again, the weight of her confession settling over the group. Sarah looked horrified, while Mark leaned back in his chair, shaking his head. I can't believe this, he muttered. Jake. Really? Ethan stood abruptly, the chair scraping loudly against the floor. This is what I've been dealing with, he said, his voice tight with anger and hurt. And now you all know. So go ahead, pick your sides. Do whatever you need to do. Emily reached for his arm. Ethan, wait. Don't, he said, pulling away. I can't do this anymore. Ethan left the cafe, the door swinging shut behind him. He walked down the street, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. The cold air bit at his skin, but he barely felt it. The group had been his foundation, his support system for years. Now it was shattered, just like his marriage, just like his trust. Back inside, the group tried to process what had just happened. Mark looked at Claire, his expression a mix of disappointment and disbelief. How could you do this to him? He asked. Claire wiped at her tears, but she didn't respond. Emily spoke up, her voice quiet. We can't just let this destroy everything, she said. But the others weren't so sure. Over the next few days, the group began to fracture. Sarah, appalled by the betrayal, distanced herself from Claire and Jake. Mark tried to remain neutral, but his attempts to mediate only made things worse. Emily, torn between loyalty to Ethan and her own guilt, found herself drifting away from everyone. Ethan, meanwhile, withdrew completely. He avoided group chats, ignored calls, and spent his evenings alone in his apartment. The betrayal had robbed him of more than just a marriage. It had taken his sense of belonging, his chosen family. One evening, Emily showed up at his door. Ethan, we need to talk, she said, her voice hesitant. He hesitated before letting her in, unsure if he wanted to hear what she had to say. I'm sorry, she began, for not saying anything sooner. I thought I was protecting you, but I realize now I just made it worse. Ethan nodded slowly. You can't protect someone by hiding the truth, Emily, he said. It only makes the fallout worse. As she left, Ethan felt a small sense of relief. One bridge, at least, hadn't been completely burned. But as for the rest of the group, he wasn't sure if they could ever recover, or if he even wanted them to. Ethan sat alone in his living room, the soft glow of the table lamp casting shadows on the walls. His apartment, once filled with warmth and laughter, now felt hollow. The events of the cafe confrontation had left him drained. His phone buzzed on the coffee table. Another message from Claire. He ignored it, letting the screen dim. She had been reaching out every day, sending texts and leaving voicemails. Each one started the same. An apology, a plea for a chance to explain, to fix things. Ethan didn't know how to respond. Could he ever trust her again? Did he even want to try? Desperate for clarity, Ethan called his older brother, Ryan, someone he hadn't spoken to about any of this. Ryan picked up on the second ring. Ethan, hey. What's going on? His voice was light. But Ethan's silence told him everything he needed to know. You sound like hell. Talk to me. Ethan took a deep breath and began recounting everything. The affair, the betrayal, the fallout with his friends. Ryan listened without interrupting, letting Ethan unload the burden he'd been carrying. When Ethan finished, Ryan sighed heavily. "That's a lot, man. I'm so sorry." "Yeah," Ethan muttered. "I don't even know what to do anymore." "Well," Ryan said carefully, "you need to ask yourself a hard question. What do you want? Not what other people want or what's easiest. What do you want, Ethan?" Ethan stared at the ceiling, Ryan's question echoing in his mind. What did he want? Did he want to fix his marriage? Walk away from it? Confront Jake again? There were no easy answers, but Ryan's words planted a seed of clarity. The next day, Ethan agreed to meet Claire. They sat at a small park bench, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the ground. Claire's face was pale, her eyes red from crying. "Thank you for meeting me," she said, her voice trembling. Ethan nodded but said nothing. He waited for her to speak. "I've been doing a lot of thinking," Claire began. "About everything. What I did, why I did it. And I know it's no excuse, but I felt like we were growing distant. Jake, he was there when I felt alone. But I know now that I made the worst mistake of my life." Ethan's jaw tightened. "You didn't just make a mistake, Claire. You destroyed our marriage. You destroyed my trust." Tears welled in Claire's eyes. "No. And I hate myself for it. But Ethan, I don't want to lose you. I want to fix this." Ethan looked at her, his heart heavy. "How do I fix this, Claire? How do I look at you and not think of Jake? How do I trust you again?" "I'm willing to do whatever it takes," she said earnestly. "Therapy, counseling, whatever you need. I just want a chance to make things right." Ethan stood, running a hand through his hair. "I need time," he said. "I can't make this decision right now. But I need space." Claire nodded, wiping her tears. "I understand," she said softly. As he walked away, Ethan felt a strange mix of relief and sorrow. He wasn't ready to forgive her, but he wasn't ready to close the door completely either. That evening, Jake called him. Ethan stared at the phone, his hand hovering over the decline button. Finally, he picked up. "What do you want, Jake?" Ethan asked, his voice cold. I wanted to say I'm sorry." Again, Jake said. "I know I can't fix what I did, but I need you to know how much I regret it." Ethan let out a bitter laugh. "Regret doesn't erase what you did." "I know," Jake said quietly. "But I can leave if that's what you want. I'll stay out of your life, out of Claire's life. I want to give you peace." Ethan paused, his mind racing. Finally, he said, "Do what you need to do, Jake. But don't expect forgiveness from me." After hanging up, Ethan sat in silence, staring at the wall. He knew that the decisions ahead wouldn't be easy, whether he chose to forgive or let go. His life would never be the same. But for the first time, he felt a flicker of control over his path, a small but powerful step toward healing. Ethan sat in the waiting room of the therapist's office, his hands clasped tightly together. It had been weeks since the confrontation with Claire and Jake, and the pain still lingered like a shadow he couldn't escape. At Ryan's suggestion, he had scheduled this session, not for anyone else, but for himself. If he was going to find clarity, he needed to start by untangling the chaos in his mind. When his name was called, Ethan stood, his legs feeling heavier than usual. The therapist, a kind-looking woman named Dr. Harris, greeted him warmly. "Come in, Ethan," she said, gesturing toward a comfortable chair. "Take your time. This is your space." Ethan settled into the chair, unsure of where to begin. After a long pause, he said, "I feel like my life's been ripped apart. My wife, she betrayed me with my best friend. And now, everything I thought I knew about my life feels like a lie." Dr. Harris nodded, her expression empathetic. "That's a heavy burden to carry. How have you been coping?" Ethan let out a bitter laugh. "Coping? Barely. I've shut myself off from everyone, even the people who didn't betray me. It's like I don't trust anyone anymore." As the session progressed, Ethan began to unpack the layers of his pain, the anger, the betrayal, and most of all, the loss of the life he thought he had. Dr. Harris guided him gently, helping him to see that his pain was valid but didn't have to define him. By the end of the session, Ethan felt a glimmer of something he hadn't felt in weeks: hope. In the following days, Ethan began to take small steps toward rebuilding his life. He reached out to a few friends outside of his old circle, people he hadn't spoken to in years. To his surprise, they welcomed him back with open arms. It felt strange at first but also refreshing, a chance to start anew. Claire, meanwhile, had left the city for a while, giving Ethan the space he had requested. Her absence was both a relief and a source of lingering sadness. He still didn't know what the future held for their marriage, but for now, he was focused on himself. One afternoon, as Ethan was sorting through old photos, Emily stopped by. "I wanted to check on you," she said, holding a cup of coffee she'd brought for him. They sat on the couch, sipping in silence for a moment before Emily spoke again. "I've been thinking a lot about what happened, about how I could have done more." Ethan shook his head. "It's not your fault, Emily. You didn't betray me. Claire and Jake did. But I knew something was off, and I didn't say anything," Emily insisted. "I should have trusted my instincts." Ethan looked at her, seeing the guilt etched on her face. "You're a good friend, Emily. And honestly, I don't know if I would have believed it even if you'd told me. Sometimes we don't see what's right in front of us." Her eyes softened, and she gave him a small smile. "You're stronger than you think, Ethan. I can see it." As the weeks turned into months, Ethan began to feel more like himself again. Therapy helped him confront the deeper wounds left by the betrayal, and his growing circle of new friends gave him a sense of belonging. For the first time in a long time, he felt like he was in control of his own story. Claire reached out occasionally, but Ethan kept their conversations brief. He wasn't ready to decide whether forgiveness was possible. That would take time, and he was okay with that. One evening, as the sun set over the city, Ethan found himself walking along a quiet path in the park. The air was crisp, the scent of blooming flowers carried on the breeze. He paused at a bench, sitting down and taking in the view. For the first time in what felt like forever, he felt at peace. He wasn't fully healed, but he was healing, and that was enough for now. Months had passed, and the seasons had shifted from summer's warmth to the crisp coolness of fall. Ethan stood on his balcony, a mug of coffee in hand, watching the leaves scatter in the wind. The weight on his chest, once a constant presence, had started to lift. He wasn't completely healed, but he was stronger now, more grounded. The pain had taught him resilience. Claire had returned to the city and reached out once more, this time asking for a final conversation. Ethan agreed, not because he wanted closure from her, but because he had found closure within himself. They met at a quiet cafe on a Sunday morning. Claire arrived, her face etched with nervousness. "Thank you for meeting me," she said as she sat down. Ethan nodded, his expression calm but unreadable. "I've done a lot of thinking," Claire began. "I know I hurt you, Ethan, and I don't expect forgiveness. I needed you to know how truly sorry I am." Ethan listened, letting her speak without interrupting. When she finished, he took a deep breath. "Claire, I don't hate you," he said. "But I can't go back to the way things were. Too much has happened." Tears welled in her eyes, but she nodded. "I understand," she whispered. They parted ways with a quiet sense of finality, both knowing their chapter together had ended. Back at home, Ethan looked through a box of old photos. Pictures of vacations, group dinners, and happy moments stared back at him, each one a snapshot of a life he no longer recognized. With steady hands, he packed the photos away, closing the lid on that part of his story. Ethan's new life was taking shape. Therapy had become a cornerstone of his growth, and he had cultivated friendships with people who valued honesty and mutual respect. Emily, too, remained a supportive presence, their bond stronger than ever. One crisp autumn morning, Ethan walked along the beach as the sun rose over the horizon. The waves crashed gently against the shore, and the air smelled of salt and renewal. He stood there, watching the light spread across the water, and for the first time he felt free, not defined by the betrayal, but by the strength he had found in its aftermath. What would you do if the people you trusted most shattered your world? Ethan's story reminds us that betrayal doesn't just test our relationships. It tests our strength, our values, and our ability to rebuild after the storm. How would you handle the choice between holding on to pain and embracing the chance to heal? Click the video on the screen now to continue this journey of self-discovery and resilience. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more powerful stories that inspire reflection and personal growth. Let's face life's challenges together, one step at a time.